authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello everyone, welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me today is going to be Chris Johnson, and we're going to be discussing his newest book, It's About You. And this is going to get into, Gnosticism and Hermeticism and ancient spiritual teachings and how it applies to everyday life and how we perceive life and react to life and, things that we could do to help us be happier with the way we're responding to life, etc. But I'll let Chris get into that since he's studied the material probably a lot more than I have. And, definitely it's his book, so he knows it a lot more than I do. But I just kind of wanted to give y'all kind of a quick hint. If you want to learn a little bit more about Chris or about his books, you can go to www.counselingforyourself.co.uk. Now, if y'all are listening to this show from, say, YouTube or iTunes or one of those places, we'd love to have you come join us live at www.talknowradio.com and join us in the chat room. Also, if you want to call in and ask questions, the number's 832-632-7904. And Chris, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Royce. I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your listeners.
And I meant to say, how are you doing today? It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon here.
Yeah, it's 11 o'clock. I'm in Los Angeles staying with friends at the moment while I'm over in the U.S.
So it's morning over there.
So we're still in the morning here, yeah. And I have a flight later this afternoon to take me to Denver because I've got some presentations to do in Denver in a couple of weeks' time. But I'm having a good time while I'm here.
Okay. Well, real quick, Mike, why don't you tell us a little about yourself and what got you interested in writing this book? I mean, how you selected your source material.
Well, I'm from a conventional Western lower middle class, trying to get to upper middle class background in the UK. My parents were from a lower middle class upbringing. And after the war, my father did his utmost to find himself a job, and he got married. He got married over in Canada, in Toronto, actually, to my mum, and trying to look for work. He went back to England. He couldn't find work over in Canada. He went back to England. I was born in Africa, in Nigeria. He went out to Nigeria because he managed to get a job there, and I was born in 1953. We lived in Africa for a little while, and then we came back to England, and I grew up in a conventional state school system. I was educated, and I was led to believe that what we need to get from life is, when you grow up, is to get a good job, work hard, get good grades at school, then you can get a good job, and then you can find a wife and have children. And that's the belief systems I bought into, handed down from my parents. And I thought that's what you needed to do in order to get a happy life. That kind of is what happened with me. I managed to get good grades. I managed to get a good job. I actually started in the casino industry when I was 19, 20. And I worked my way through the management system, and I was getting paid good money. And I was married, and we had 2 children. And around about my early 30s, I had what we might call an existential crisis. I was kind of sitting there one day going, what am I doing this for? I'm not really happy with my life, even though I had good money. And there was no real problem with my marriage, particularly. And that led me into some depressive interludes. I began to get depression, and that affected my work, and I lost my job, and my marriage broke up, And I found myself staying with a friend, and in pretty bad way, in pretty bad shape, and I still hadn't got any real idea as to what I needed to do with myself in life. And at that time I went down to see my father and had a good long chat with him about my situation. And he introduced me, gave me Seth Speaks from the body of information called The Seth Material, authored by Jane Roberts. And I read this book while I was staying at my friend's house, and it hooked me. There was a lot in this book that was hugely profound to me and moved me into looking more into it, because within the Seth Material there seemed to be some really good ideas about how you might go about changing your belief systems in order that you could live a fulfilling life. So I spent somewhere around, this would be back in the 80s, I spent somewhere around 5 years studying the Seth Material specifically. And on another chat with my father, after I lost my job, he backed me to go back to university, full-time education at university, so that I could study psychology. Because one of the books from the Seth Material called The Nature of the Psyche really intrigued me, and I was really into the psychology element of the Seth Material. And I chatted with my father, and he said, well, why don't you do a formal education in psychology and see what happens with what you want to do after you've done that? So I went to London University in the 90s, and a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology from there. And I then went on and followed that up with a master's degree at Surrey University. All really being done at the same time as I continued to study the Seth Material and then other metaphysical material, other channeled sources. I have a kind of scientific mind, and I needed to verify as best I could what the Seth Material was telling me. So I pursued other metaphysical literature sources, and lo and behold, they were saying very much or very similar things to what Seth was saying about the nature of our reality, the nature of how we work out how to live our lives, what's the best way to go about it, this kind of thing. I was still skeptical for a good few years, so I went and studied some conventional sources of wisdom, some philosophical, some from spiritual, in the spiritual literature, scientific literature. I got into things like quantum physics and this kind of thing, and what that was trying to tell us about the nature of physical reality. And eventually I came to the conclusion that I needed to include this material within my life, and I did so. It led me to studying Eastern traditions of medicine to do with what Seth Material and others were saying about how the body works, how the mind works, and how the energy flow system of the body works. So I studied a few Eastern traditions. That led me into studying energy psychology, which I came across late 90s, early 2000, originated by Gary Craig. EFT, Emotional Freedom Techniques, was one of the first modalities under energy psychology that I studied. And I set up my own private practice that was a kind of eclectic mix of all of the different studying I'd done on the conventional ground of psychology, but I introduced some exercises and some ideas from the metaphysical literature into it. I can continue talking now if you like.
Well, no, I was didn't want to interrupt you.
Right. Okay.
I was trying to be polite. But yeah,
you were very polite. I thought I might be going on a bit there.
But yeah, that was really very interesting. And, you know, a lot of people, they might have said to you at some point, do you find channeled material to be a scientific process? And I think some might and some might not. What's your take on it?
Well, this was always the problem, in inverted commas, for me to start with, because I did have my mentality, did have a scientific worldview that you need to be able to prove this stuff physically, otherwise it's not valid. But as I continued to study the material, not just the Seth material, but other metaphysical literature, and as I studied other philosophical works, it was very clear to me that an awful lot of information in conventional philosophical works, conventional scientific literature, comes from the same kind of source as metaphysical channeled literature is accessing. In other words, someone like Albert Einstein was channeling some of the ideas that he used in order to form his theory of relativity. There's a lot of documentation of very eminent conventional scientists who are essentially using their inner senses to access information in the non-physical realm. Another famous psychologist, Carl Jung, for example, is another guy that was accessing his own intuitive inner senses in order to develop his theories on psychology.
I find that fascinating. Me and Normandy Ellis were just talking about Einstein having done that same thing just yesterday.
That's right. One of the ways in which anyone can access non-physically established information, in other words, information in the spiritual realm, is through sleep, for example. And Albert Einstein and Carl Jung had their dream journals next to them on their bedside table, because their inner self would be communicating in their dreams and finding out information, and they would wake up with some inspiration about whatever it is they're studying at that time, and they'd write that down in a dream journal, and that would help them in their work. So getting back to your question about how does the scientific fraternity look at all this, yes, you have, at one end, you have the scientific people who must have physical proof that this is a valid information source. But of course, that's impossible, because this is a non-physical information source. So how can you use physicality to prove something that's non-physical? And on the other side, as I'm now a member of the Scientific and Medical Network, which is an organization in England that's similar to IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences in California. I'm a member of Scientific and Medical Network, and they have a good number of bona fide scientists who are beginning to realize that there are unconventional ways, shall we say, of gaining information. And a lot of that information can come from the spiritual realm through whatever means we want to use. It can be through some interesting stuff like remote viewing is an indication of the opening up of someone's inner senses. Everybody has these inner senses. Everybody has the ability to access information on the non-physical side of reality.
That's interesting. I know that you got astronaut Edgar Mitchell right here in the United States has the Institute for Noetic Sciences, and he has scientists on his team that's making the same discovery. It's like spirituality is getting more and more and more accepted by the scientific community a little bit at a time as time goes on.
That's right. There's the IONS Institute the sister organization, if you like, of Scientific and Medical Network in the UK. And these have members within the institutions. They have lots of scientists who keep their scientific approach to this phenomenon, but they have now an open mind and they're not dismissing it out of hand anymore. And they are still approaching it as we should do. We need to, as best we can, prove, in inverted commas, that this is valid, that this link between the physical world and the non-physical world, there are valid links, there are valid channels that we can get through to get information from the spiritual realm. And they are approaching it now in institutions like IONS. Dean Radin, for example, is the head of research, and I actually was at a conference recently where Dean Radin, this was in the UK, and Dean Radin was on some sort of Skype-type link to the conference. And he is a precision scientist. He won't accept stuff that's in any way airy-fairy. He needs to actually get some good scientific evidence. And by taking that approach, he is beginning to make inroads into discovering a lot of phenomena that come from the non-physical dimension, and they appear within the physical dimension, sometimes in spooky ways, sometimes in frightening ways. But there is a good deal of information now being discovered by bona fide scientists.
Okay. Now, we had a question in the chat room. Typhon was asking, what about people in other professions like authors? Would their ideas come from the same place, like H.P. Lovecraft had similar dreams?
Like what did you say?
Like H.P. Lovecraft. In other words,
oh, I see, the author, yeah.
So authors also get their information, some of them from channeled sources?
Well, whether they get their information from channeled sources is one thing, but actually I think if you talk to a lot of authors who, particularly if they're writing works of fiction, I would call my book non-fiction, but if they're writing works of fiction, they will need to get in the zone when they're writing. And that getting in the zone is actually getting themselves into an altered state of consciousness, whereby they're using their inner senses to intuit what to write. And they'll just write, and it will flow from them, and it will be coming from their essence self in the non-physical realm. And then there are people like myself. I don't think there are that many people like myself who have really got to grips with the messages within the various metaphysical channeled sources and amalgamated and combined them and synthesized them all together, which is what my book's about. Getting a lot of different sources in the metaphysical literature saying the same kind of thing, and then discerning exactly what it is they are saying from a practical point of view. So the set material, for example, excuse me, would be telling us how we need to behave in accordance with natural principles, how the natural world behaves. And the problem with the human species, if you were, is that we've come away from these natural ways of behaving, which are to do with cooperation, by the way, with all other living forms and expressions of consciousness. So my book's bringing these ideas into a form whereby, if you read the book, it contains within it practical guidance on what you can do for yourself in order to get back to these natural principles of living your life. And if you can get back in any way, shape or form into that kind of way of living, then you should be able to live a peaceful and, more importantly, a very fulfilling life.
Okay. Also, this person was wanting to know, can you be a medium without realizing it? Can you channel, say, somebody like Seth, but think it's just you getting the idea yourself and not realize you're really getting it channeled?
Can you be a medium without realizing it? Yeah, I would say that's absolutely right. Everybody has this potential within them. That's something that actually comes from channeled sources. Seth would say it, and there's a few that I've studied would say that every single individual has the ability to access what we're talking about here is inner senses, intuitive, empathic senses that can come through to you whenever you like. And as I said earlier, you might get a few authors that can sit down and meditate, and then they will be accessing these inner senses and bringing them information they'd like to write down. So it is well documented within research into channeled literature that channeling itself, or intuitive behavior, or mediumistic behavior, is something that can just suddenly appear in somebody's life. They'll find that they will have a kind of weird experience whereby they just intuit, they just simply know about something. And it happens to the layperson, whereby something like, well, a classic example is knowing who's on the other end of the phone. That's one of them. Then you'll have people who will be sensing that if their loved one takes a plane trip, that they shouldn't really be on that plane. And there are lots of incidents of these kinds of traveling intuitions that the layperson just comes to them. What that person doesn't realize is that they are naturally accessing their inner senses to bring them information about probabilities. Seth goes into this very deeply about probable futures that become energized the nearer we get to the point of that future time. Each individual can access that information, and it may be useful. Of course, we're trained to ignore it. We're trained in the education system of the West to ignore our emotions, to ignore our intuitions, to ignore our impulses, this kind of thing. So a lot of people, there's probably millions of people who get these moments of being a medium in this little way, who will dismiss it and not bother telling their loved one not to get on the plane, for example, and
wish later they had.
And what I'm really saying here is that everybody can access their inner senses. Everybody can be a medium, if you like, and it can happen to you even though you don't realize it's going to happen. But what I think is a benefit to people is that they really get in touch with themselves when they do find that this is happening, and develop accessing and utilizing their inner senses. And that is something that I cover in my book. And the book is about how you can do specific practical exercises that will get you in touch with your inner senses, and start by doing simple stuff and intuiting and seeing if you can alter your state of consciousness and start getting information that's useful to you, that kind of thing. And simply getting in touch with your essence self. If you're of a religious inclination, you might call that your soul. But the metaphysical channel literature calls your soul your entity or essence, your greater self.
Or your higher self.
Your higher self. It's not a hierarchy. This is part of the greater self that you have. You have a non-physical essence, spiritual side to yourself, and you have the physical self that needs to operate in the physical realm. And that has a set of psychological elements, one of which is the ego, and that has been the one element of the totality of the self that has been championed in the West in its education system, and is leading us into the kinds of chaos that we're experiencing in the political world, the financial systems, the education systems, and in fact in religious systems.
Right.
This breakdown and chaos is to do with the fact that we have concentrated all our thinking and focus upon one small aspect of ourselves, which is the ego self. Now, that's not to beat the ego self up. We need to have an ego self. Your ego self is designed to keep you alive in the physical realm and plan out what you need to do for the future by looking at what you did in the past. And it's a logical, reasoning, psychological element of anybody's outer self, and it needs to be there. However, if we have spent too much time simply focused on that, and that has led us into the kind of chaos we're seeing at the moment. So this indeed is a time of change. If we are going to get through this time of chaos, we need to think very much more deeply on the nature of ourselves, and particularly re-engage with our spiritual self, re-engage with our essence self, if you like.
Well, I've had some authors that would say that the idea is to learn how to kind of like be a mediator between the soul and the ego to try to, get a balance going, in other words, where both the soul and the ego are, playing their proper role instead of an imbalance on one side or the other. Is that pretty much what Seth teaches?
That's pretty much, that's good question. That is what Seth and the other metaphysical literature people are, the guides are trying to tell us. We've gone over to championing the ego side of ourselves, and we've ignored the spiritual side of ourselves, the essence self. And we do, in fact, need to bring a balance back in order to operate in a peaceful manner with regard to everyone else in the physical realm, in regard to all other creations of consciousness.
So
animals, the environment, other people. We need to draw together again with our spiritual self. It's schizophrenia. As a species, we have schizophrenia. There is a division between the ego self and the spiritual side. And you can't get on very well if you have this split between the two. We need to bring them back together in balance, and that will lead us into, hopefully, a much more peaceful world in the future. More than one metaphysical guide says that this is a very intriguing and exciting time of change, where we will lead ourselves into a better future. I say better with caution. It's not really a judgmental thing. We will lead into a more evolved, would be a better word. We will lead ourselves into a more evolved way of living, which is what we've lost over the centuries of championing the ego.
Okay. Now, what I was actually kind of looking for a minute ago, and I did a poor job of asking it, would be, are we talking about less attention to the ego as a whole, or do we more specifically mean a different kind of attention? I mean, by attention, are you referring to, for example, catering to the soul versus learning about the soul and the soul's role in life and what it should be?
Yeah, you can't not cater to the ego. It's the ego is the psychological element.
Right. So you want to give the soul attention, you just don't want to cater to it.
You want to you want to bring the soul, that other part of yourself, actually to my mum, and trying to look for work. He went back to England. He couldn't find work over in Canada. He went back to England. I was born in Africa, in Nigeria. He went out to Nigeria because he managed to get a job there. And I was born in 1953. We lived in Africa for a little while, and then we came back to England, and I grew up in a conventional state school system. I was educated, and I was led to believe that what we need to get from life is, when you grow up, is to get a good job, work hard, get good grades at school, then you can get a good job, and then you can find a wife and have children, and that's the belief systems I bought into, handed down from my parents, and I thought that's what you needed to do in order to get a happy life. I'm in Los Angeles staying with friends at the moment while I'm over in the US.
So it's morning over there.
So we're still in the morning here, yeah. And I have a flight later this afternoon to take me to Denver because I've got some presentations to do in Denver in a couple of weeks' time. But I'm having a good time while I'm here.
Okay. Well, real quick, Mike, why don't you tell us a little about yourself and what got you interested in writing this book? I mean, how you selected your source material.
Well, I'm from a conventional Western lower middle class, trying to get to upper middle class background in the UK. My parents were from a lower middle class upbringing, and after the war my father did his utmost to find himself a job, and he got married. He got married over in Canada, in Toronto. That kind of is what happened with me. I managed to get good grades. I managed to get a good job. I actually started in the casino industry when I was 19, 20, and I worked my way through the management system, and I was getting paid good money, and I was married, and we had 2 children, and around about my early 30s, I had what we might call an existential crisis. I was kind of sitting there one day going, what am I doing this for? I'm not really happy with my life. Even though I had good money, and there was no real problem with my marriage particularly. And that led me into some depressive interludes. I began to get depression, and that affected my work, and eventually I lost my job, and my marriage broke up, and
definitely it's his book, so he knows it a lot more than I do. But I just kind of wanted to give y'all kind of a quick hint. If you want to learn a little bit more about Chris or about his books, you can go to www.counselingforyourself.co.uk. Now, if y'all are listening to this show from, say, YouTube or iTunes or one of those places, we'd love to have you come join us live at www.talknowradio.com and join us in the chat room. Also, if you want to call in and ask questions, the number's 832-632-7904. And Chris, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Royce. I'm happy to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk to your listeners.
And I meant to say, how are you doing today? It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon here.
Yeah, it's 11 o'clock.
For authors, filmmakers, entertainment, and all your listening needs. Listen now to Talk Now Radio, where no topic is taboo.
Hello everyone, welcome to Talk Now Radio. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me today is going to be Chris Johnson, and we're going to be discussing his newest book, It's About You. And this is going to get into, Gnosticism and Hermeticism and ancient spiritual teachings and how it applies to everyday life and how we perceive life and react to life and, you know, things that we could do to help us be happier with the way we're responding to life, etc. But I'll let Chris get into that since he's studied the material probably a lot more than I have.